In the sterile laboratories of Wright Field, Ohio, the engineers called it impossible. Their calculations and stress models proved that mounting such heavy armament on a B-25 Mitchell would tear the wings clean off. It was a structural nightmare, a fool's errand. But 10,000 miles away in the sweltering heat of a New Guinea air base, one man, fueled by desperation and a powerful personal motive, saw it differently. He wasn't using blueprints. He was using salvaged parts and sheer force of will. The engineers called his creation a monster. The Japanese would soon call it a nightmare. This is the story of a weapon born not in a factory, but on the front lines, and the man who willed it into existence. By the middle of 1942, the air war in the Pacific had settled into a grim and costly routine. American air power, a cornerstone of its strategy, was facing a crippling problem. It couldn't reliably hit Japanese ships. The doctrine of the day was built around the high-altitude bomber, a magnificent machine like the B-17 Flying Fortress, designed to fly in tight formations miles above the Earth and drop bombs with supposedly pinpoint accuracy. But against a twisting, turning destroyer or a fast-moving troop transport, pinpoint was a fantasy. From 20,000 feet, a ship was a moving speck. Factoring in wind, altitude, and the vessel's evasive maneuvers, the bomber crews were performing a near-impossible calculation. The result was a staggering rate of failure. For every 100 bombs dropped, perhaps 1 or 2 would find their mark. The rest would send up useless columns of white water, monuments to a failing strategy. This brutal arithmetic was not lost on General George Kenney. When he took command of the 5th Air Force in August of 1942, he inherited a command short on supplies, plagued by tropical disease, and facing an existential crisis of confidence. His pilots were brave, but they were being asked to do the impossible, and they were dying for it. Kenney knew that to win the war for the islands of the Pacific, he had to sever the Japanese supply lines. To do that, he had to sink their ships. He needed a new weapon, a new tactic, a new way of thinking. He found it in a man who, by all accounts, shouldn't have even been there. His name was Paul Gunn, a 43-year-old civilian technical advisor. A former Navy pilot and airline manager, he was older than nearly every pilot under Kenney's command, earning him the affectionate nickname Pappy. Gunn was no desk-bound theorist. He was a master tinkerer, a man who understood machinery with an intuitive genius that baffled formally trained engineers. But for Pappy Gunn, this war was intensely personal. When the Philippines fell, his wife Polly and their 4 children were captured. They were now prisoners, languishing behind the walls of the Santo Tomas Internment Camp in Manila. Every day, Gunn woke with one singular, all-consuming purpose: to liberate his family. Every Japanese ship sailing with reinforcements was an obstacle, another link in the chain that held his loved ones captive. He watched the high-altitude bombers fail, and a radical idea began to form. The solution, he reasoned, was not to fly higher, but to fly lower, dangerously low. Skim the waves so you couldn't miss. But this presented its own lethal problem: anti-aircraft fire. A bomber flying at mast height was a huge, slow-moving target. To survive, it couldn't just drop bombs. It had to fight back. It had to become a predator. Gunn envisioned a bomber transformed, its nose stripped of its glass and bombardier, and packed instead with a terrifying concentration of forward-firing, heavy-caliber machine guns. It would approach a ship not as a bomber, but as a flying battleship, suppressing the enemy gunners with an overwhelming storm of lead before delivering the killing blow. General Kenny gave Gunn the green light, a small workshop in Brisbane, Australia, and a simple command: make it work. What followed was not a process of careful engineering, but of inspired improvisation. Gunn's workshop was a graveyard of damaged aircraft, a boneyard of opportunity. He and his small, hand-picked team of mechanics became scavengers, pulling .50 caliber machine guns from the wings of wrecked P-40 fighters, cannibalizing the wiring harnesses from downed bombers, and fabricating gun mounts from scrap metal. Their first test subject was not the B-25 Mitchell, but its smaller cousin, the A-20 Havoc. It was a fast, nimble light bomber, and Gunn saw its potential. He tore out the fragile plexiglass nose, home to a single navigator, and replaced it with a solid metal plate. Through this plate, he mounted 4 heavy machine guns, creating a crude but brutally effective ground attack craft. The initial tests were terrifying and spectacular. When the pilot squeezed the trigger, the entire aircraft shuddered violently. The noise was deafening, and a torrent of tracer rounds erupted from the nose, shredding targets on the ground with an efficiency that left observers speechless. Kenny was impressed. The A-20 commerce destroyers, as they were nicknamed, proved devastating against Japanese barges and coastal fortifications, but they were a stepping stone. To take on warships, Kenny needed something bigger, tougher, and with a longer reach. He needed the B-25. The B-25 Mitchell was a workhorse, a sturdy, reliable, medium bomber. But it was about to undergo a transformation so radical that its own manufacturer would later refuse to believe it was possible. Gunn took a brand new B-25C model and performed radical surgery. Again, the Bombardier's station was the first to go. In its place, Gunn and his team installed a package of 4 .50 caliber machine guns. But he didn't stop there. He then designed and attached external blister packs to the sides of the fuselage, each housing another 2 machine guns. This brought the forward firing armament to 8 heavy machine guns, all controlled by the pilot. When fired simultaneously, they unleashed a concentrated blast of firepower equivalent to a heavy fighter squadron. The sheer force of the recoil was immense, slowing the plane by several miles per hour. This modification, however, was only half of the equation. Gunn's flying gun platform was the key that unlocked an equally radical new tactic: skip bombing. For months, Allied pilots had been experimenting with this high-risk maneuver, which involved flying at near zero altitude and releasing a bomb that would literally skip across the water's surface like a flat stone before slamming into the side of a ship at the waterline. It was incredibly accurate if the pilot could get close enough. But getting that close, flying straight and level at mast height, was a suicide run against a ship's bristling anti-aircraft defenses. Pappy Gunn's strafer changed everything. The pilot would now approach the target with all 8 guns blazing. This wall of lead would sweep the enemy deck, suppressing the gun crews, knocking out anti-aircraft emplacements, and allowing the pilot to hold his nerve for those critical final seconds of the bombing run. The bomber was no longer a passive victim on its approach. It was an active aggressor. For the young crews of the 5th Air Force, this was a paradigm shift. They were no longer told to avoid danger, but to fly directly into the heart of it. They trained relentlessly, learning to handle their bucking, vibrating machines at treetop level. Their bomber, once a symbol of high-altitude precision, had been reborn as a low-level brute, a sea-skimming dragon. The theory was sound, the weapon was built, but it remained unproven in the crucible of a major naval engagement. The engineers in Ohio might have called it impossible, but soon, an entire Japanese convoy would give it a different name. The opportunity to prove the naysayers wrong arrived in late February of 1943. Allied codebreakers and reconnaissance aircraft picked up the trail of a massive Japanese convoy, codenamed Operation 81. 16 vessels, 8 heavily laden troop transports, and 8 fully armed destroyer escorts had departed from the fortress port of Rabaul. Their destination was Leh, a critical Japanese stronghold in New Guinea. On board were nearly 7,000 soldiers, reinforcements desperately needed to halt the Allied advance. For the Japanese command, the mission was vital. For General Kenny, it was the perfect target. The convoy was sighted on March 1st, but poor weather provided it with a temporary shield. On March 2nd, the skies cleared. Kenny unleashed his B-17 flying fortresses in a series of conventional high-altitude strikes. The results were frustratingly predictable. The bombers flew at 7,000 feet, dropping their payloads on the maneuvering ships below. One transport was hit and sunk, and 2 other ships were damaged, but the vast majority of the convoy sailed on, its formidable anti-aircraft screen seemingly intact. The Japanese captains were likely reassured. The Americans were using the same old playbook. They had weathered the worst of it. They were wrong. As the sun rose on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, the real storm broke. From airfields around Port Moresby, the engines of a new kind of air armada roared to life. First came the escorts, long-range P-38 Lightnings, climbing high to sweep the skies of any patrolling Japanese Zero fighters. Then came the killers. RAF Beaufighters from Australia, twin-engine aircraft armed with cannons, flew alongside the radical, new American B-25 strafers. This was the moment of truth for Pappy Gunn's creation. As they approached the convoy, the Allied force split into a perfectly coordinated wave of destruction. Under the command of leaders like Captain Ed Larner, the pilots descended to the waves, coming in so low their propellers churned the sea spray. The Japanese gunners on the destroyers and transports swung their weapons to bear, expecting another high-altitude attack. Instead, they saw a terrifying sight, a wave of bombers screaming toward them at mast height. The battle began not with the whistle of falling bombs, but with the deafening roar of machine guns. The B-25s opened fire from thousands of yards out, their 8 forward guns concentrating an unbelievable volume of fire on the ship's bridges and gun emplacements. Tracers crisscrossed the water, creating a lethal web of lead. Japanese gun crews who had stood bravely against distant bombers were now cut down before they could even get a clear shot. The decks were swept clean. The suppression was so total, so brutally efficient, that it gave the pilots the priceless seconds they needed. With the anti-aircraft fire silenced, the strafers held their course, rock steady, flying directly into the teeth of an enemy who could no longer bite back. Then came the bombs. Released just hundreds of feet from their targets, the 500-pound bombs skipped across the water's surface, striking the unarmored hulls of the transports at the waterline. The effect was catastrophic. Explosions ripped through the ships, which were packed with troops, fuel, and ammunition. Within minutes, the placid blue of the Bismarck Sea was scarred with pillars of black smoke and the orange blossoms of secondary explosions. One after another, the Japanese transports were hit, crippled, and left burning. The textbook doctrine of high-altitude bombing was erased in a single, violent morning. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea raged for 2 days, but its outcome was decided in those first few hours. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Japanese convoy, stripped of its cohesion and anti-aircraft defenses, was systematically dismantled. B-17s, which had proven so ineffective from high altitude, now came in at medium levels to rain bombs on the burning, stationary hulks. The A-20 strafers that Pappy Gunn had first modified joined the fray, strafing life rafts and barges, ensuring that none of the thousands of enemy soldiers would reach the shores of New Guinea. By the time the sun set on March 4th, the sea was a graveyard. All 8 troop transports and 4 of their destroyer escorts were at the bottom of the ocean. The remaining 4 destroyers, heavily damaged, fled back to Rabaul, having rescued only a fraction of the men they were sent to protect. Out of nearly 7,000 troops, fewer than 1,000 made it to their destination. The 5th Air Force, by contrast, had suffered minimal losses. It was one of the most lopsided victories of the entire Pacific War, a strategic blow from which the Japanese in New Guinea would never recover. The news of the victory electrified the Allied command. General Douglas MacArthur called it a turning point. General Kenny's gamble had paid off beyond his wildest expectations, and at the center of it all was Pappy Gunn and his impossible airplane. The B-25 strafer was no longer a field experiment. It was a legend. Word of this miraculous new weapon traveled up the chain of command, eventually landing on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, the chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces in Washington. He was intrigued but deeply skeptical. The reports from the Pacific sounded like exaggerated fiction. He ordered the technical experts at Wright Field in Ohio, the very same engineers who had deemed the concept structurally insane, to investigate. Gunn was ordered back to the United States. He arrived not as a maverick tinkerer, but as a combat-proven innovator. He brought with him the flight data, the after-action reports, and the undeniable evidence of sunken ships. When he presented his modified B-25 to the engineers, they were aghast. The workmanship was rough, the wiring unconventional, the structural modifications a clear violation of every safety protocol in the book. They declared it unsafe to fly, a death trap, yet they couldn't argue with its results. Reluctantly, Hap Arnold recognized the genius behind the madness. The strafer concept had to be standardized, professionalized, and mass-produced. Gunn was sent to the North American Aviation Factory in Long Beach, California, the birthplace of the B-25. His job was to translate his battlefield expedients into formal factory blueprints. It was a clash of cultures. Gunn, the pragmatic, hands-on mechanic, was now working with slide rule-wielding engineers who lived by the book. They argued over stress tolerances and aerodynamic principles, but Gunn held his ground, armed with the simple, irrefutable truth: his planes worked. The collaboration resulted in the first factory-produced strafer, the B-25G. It was a cleaner, more refined version of Gunn's original monster. The 8 machine guns in the nose were replaced with a formidable 75mm M4 cannon, the same cannon used on the Sherman tank, supplemented by 2 50-caliber machine guns. It was a flying artillery piece. The first B-25G rolled off the assembly line in May of 1943, just 2 months after the Bismarck Sea triumph. This was only the beginning. The G model was soon followed by the H and J variants, which reverted to an even heavier machine gun armament, often featuring a staggering 12 forward-firing guns. Pappy Gunn's back alley creation had become the official face of American air power in the Pacific. As the factory-built strafers began pouring into the Pacific theater, they fundamentally changed the nature of air combat. The B-25 was no longer just a ship killer, It evolved into a brutally effective multi-role attack aircraft, a jack-of-all-trades that could dominate the battlefield in a way no single aircraft had before. Squadrons of these new gunships became the tip of the spear for General Kenny's island-hopping campaign across New Guinea and into the Philippines. They were used to obliterate Japanese airfields, their forward-firing guns sweeping across parked aircraft and fuel dumps, turning them into infernos before a single bomb was dropped. They became jungle exterminators, flying low over dense canopy to strafe enemy troop concentrations and supply lines that were invisible from higher altitudes. The psychological impact on the Japanese soldier was immense. The distinctive silhouette of a B-25 approaching at treetop level became a harbinger of instant, overwhelming violence. There was no defense against it. A machine gun nest, a hidden artillery piece, a command bunker, all could be erased in a single, thunderous pass. The strafer was a weapon of terror as much as it was a weapon of tactics. For Pappy Gunn, however, every victory, every successful mission was merely a step toward a much more personal goal. While he was revolutionizing aerial warfare and advising generals, his heart and mind were thousands of miles away in Manila. He worked with a relentless, almost manic energy, driven by the constant gnawing fear for his family's safety. He flew countless missions himself, not for glory, but because every operational sortie brought the Allies one day closer to the Philippines. He knew the conditions inside the Santo Tomas camp were deteriorating. Food was scarce, disease was rampant, and the Japanese guards were growing increasingly brutal as the tide of the war turned against them. Gunn leveraged his newfound fame and his connections within the high command to ensure that the liberation of civilian prisoners in the Philippines remained a top priority. He became a constant nagging voice in the ears of planners and strategists, a human reminder of the civilians caught in the crossfire. As MacArthur's forces prepared for the invasion of the Philippines at Leyte in late 1944, Gunn was there, not as an advisor, but as a combatant. He was determined to be part of the force that would free his wife and children. The campaign was a long and bloody slog, but by January of 1945, American forces were closing in on Manila. The final push into the city was a desperate, street-by-street fight. On the night of February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division broke through the Japanese lines and raced toward the Santo Tomas Internment Camp. They smashed through the gates, overwhelming the surprised guards in a swift and violent assault. For the thousands of emaciated prisoners inside, some of whom had endured 3 years of captivity, the sight of American soldiers was a miracle. The following day, as the camp was being secured, a lone aircraft circled overhead. In the cockpit was Paul Pappy Gunn. He had received word of the liberation and had flown to see it with his own eyes. From the air, he watched as the American flag was raised over the camp. Down below, amidst the chaos and the tears of joy, were his wife, Polly, and his 4 children, alive, safe, and finally free. His personal war, the one that had fueled his incredible journey of innovation and perseverance, was finally over. He had not only built a weapon that changed the course of the war, he had helped wield it to rescue the people he loved most. The reunion of the Gunn family was a rare moment of profound personal victory amidst the vast, impersonal machinery of war. Pappy Gunn, the man who had stared down both enemy anti-aircraft fire and the stubborn bureaucracy of his own side, had achieved his ultimate objective. His story could have ended there, a perfect footnote in the annals of the Pacific Campaign. But the legacy of his creation was just beginning. The strafer concept, born of necessity in a crude workshop, had permanently altered bomber doctrine. It shattered the rigid distinction between the high-altitude strategic bomber and the low-level tactical fighter. Gunn had proven that a bomber could be a hunter, a proactive weapon that created its own opportunities rather than simply exploiting those created by others. This new philosophy rippled through aircraft design and military strategy for decades to come. The lessons learned from the B-25 gunships directly influenced the development of a new class of aircraft. In the jungles of Vietnam, the concept of a heavy aircraft providing overwhelming, precise fire support was resurrected in the form of the AC-47 Spooky, a modified cargo plane armed with side-firing miniguns. This, in turn, evolved into the modern AC-130 gunship, a flying fortress that circles high above the battlefield, directing a fearsome arsenal of cannons and machine guns with pinpoint accuracy. The spirit of the B-25 strafer lives on in this formidable machine, a direct descendant of Gunn's vision. Similarly, the idea of building an aircraft around a powerful gun became the central design principle of the legendary A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog. This aircraft, designed specifically for close air support, is essentially a massive cannon with wings, a modern incarnation of the strafer's brute force philosophy. The Warthog's ability to absorb punishment and deliver devastating fire on ground targets is a direct echo of the tactics honed by Gunn's pilots over the Bismarck Sea. The B-25 strafer, therefore, was not merely a successful modification. It was a conceptual breakthrough. It demonstrated that battlefield innovation is often driven not by committees and corporations, but by individuals who are closest to the problem, who understand the immediate, life-or-death calculus of combat. Pappy Gunn was not an aeronautical engineer with a doctorate. He was a pilot and a mechanic who saw a problem and refused to accept the conventional answer. He was the quintessential American archetype, the backyard inventor, the maverick who trusts his gut and his hands more than a textbook. His modifications were not elegant. They were blunt, forceful, and brutally pragmatic. He didn't ask, "Is this how it's supposed to be done?" He asked, "Will this work?" This pragmatic, results-driven approach became a hallmark of the Allied effort in the Pacific, a theater where immense distances and logistical challenges demanded constant improvisation. Gunn's success empowered a generation of commanders and ground crews to experiment, to modify, and to adapt their equipment to the unique challenges they faced, often in direct defiance of stateside regulations. The story of the strafer is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are born from the simplest of motives. For the engineers at Wright Field, the problem was one of aerodynamics and structural integrity. For Pappy Gunn, the problem was a Japanese ship carrying soldiers who stood between him and his family. His desperate personal mission gave him a clarity of purpose that no blueprint or mathematical formula could ever provide. He didn't just see an airplane, he saw a key, a tool to unlock a prison gate halfway across the world. After the war, Paul Gunn continued his life in aviation, returning to the Philippines to help rebuild the nation's airline industry. He remained a larger-than-life figure, a pilot's pilot who was more comfortable in a cockpit than anywhere else. Tragically, his life was cut short on October 11th, 1957. While flying in the Philippines during a typhoon, his plane went down, and the man who had survived the most ferocious air combat of the Second World War was claimed by the fury of nature. He was 58 years old. Yet the impact of his work endures. The B-25 strafer stands as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war, a weapon that perfectly matched a specific need at a critical moment. It was a war winner, not because it was the most advanced or technologically sophisticated aircraft, but because it was the right tool in the hands of brave men who developed a new way to fight. It allowed a medium bomber to punch with the force of a battleship, to dominate the maritime battlefield in a way that naval planners had never imagined. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was its grand debut, a stunning proof of concept that sent a shockwave through the Japanese military. They had no counter for it. Their supply lines, once thought to be protected by a screen of naval firepower, were now terrifyingly vulnerable to this new form of aerial assault. The confidence of the Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine was shattered, and their ability to reinforce and resupply their isolated island garrisons was crippled for the remainder of the war. More than just the story of a machine. This is a story of human ingenuity under extreme pressure. It reminds us that history is not solely shaped by grand strategies conceived in distant capitals, but also by the grit and determination of individuals on the front lines. Pappy Gunn saw his fellow pilots dying while executing a flawed doctrine. He saw a war being prolonged, pushing the reunion with his family further into an uncertain future, and he refused to accept it. He took a perfectly good airplane and, in the eyes of the experts, broke it. He tore out its delicate scientific heart, the bomb sight and the bombardier's station, and replaced it with brute force. In doing so, he forged a weapon that fit the savage reality of the Pacific theater. He created a masterpiece not of engineering, but of sheer unyielding will. The ghost of his creation still haunts the skies, its legacy written in the design of modern attack aircraft and in the doctrine that guides them. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most impossible idea is the only one that will work, and that the greatest catalyst for innovation is not a government contract, but a singular, burning purpose.